good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of our podcast series. This is episode number 3, celebrating Franklintennial, which is the 225th birthday of Franklinton. And we want to thank all of our all the contributors and sponsors before we get started. So we want to make sure that we thank Jim Fia Productions for all of the production work that they're doing with this. The Franklintennial Committee for supporting the idea and helping us fundraise for it. Land Grant for letting us use this beautiful facility with all kinds of energy in the background. We're thrilled to be here recording this series. And then our sponsors, Kaufman Development and Casto, both of which have been huge contributors, developers in the neighborhood. And we're grateful that they're supporting this effort to record some of this history and get these conversations on film. We also want to recognize that working with Jim Fia Productions today is a group of interns, 4 interns with transit arts, and they're through Gladden Community House, and that is a program that was started by Jackie Calderon. And you might remember the last name Calderon if you're familiar with the beginnings of Bottoms Up Coffee Shop, because Josh was a part of that. And so Jackie's been an integral part of a lot of things in this community involving transit art. So we're grateful that the 4 interns are here today helping with this production. So today I'm really excited to invite our guest for episode number 3. And it's really appropriate that we have interns from Gladden Community House today, because we have Kevin Ballard also from Gladden Community House today. And also with us is a longtime Franklinton resident, huge supporter and advocate for the neighborhood, Pauline Edwards. And so I want to welcome both of you guys. I've known you for a long time. I consider both of you great friends, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. So Pauline, if you would just give us a couple minutes about who you are, maybe when you moved to the neighborhood, and just kind of let us know what your affiliation is with Franklinton.
My name is Pauline Edwards, and I came to Franklinton in 1984, and I've been here ever since. And I'm a very advocate for Franklinton. I love Franklinton. That's why I have not left Franklinton.
Absolutely. And I know that especially north of Broad. You talk about north of Broad a lot. You've lived north of Broad ever since you've been in the neighborhood on Meek Avenue. And I know that you've been a strong advocate for development on that side of the corridor. Because for all kinds of reasons, a lot of development just didn't happen over there for a while. But now you're starting to see those effects. And so we're really glad to have you here and continuing to advocate for North Broad. So Kevin, if you'll give us a couple minutes about what your affiliations with Franklinton and your job at Gladden Community House.
Well, I'm COO Gladden Community House. I came in 1987, so I've been here 35 years. Gladden is the settlement house or community center that was created to serve this neighborhood in 1905. So we've been around a long time. And we do a whole different range of programs to address the most important issues in the neighborhood, which primarily we've focused on education and poverty. I've done a lot of different things at Gladden. I actually came to run the sports program, which is what I did for about 5 years. And then I moved on to doing mostly grant writing and publishing a community newspaper called the Franklinton News, which started before me, but I published it from 1990 to 2016.
Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit more about that later in the conversation. And I do want to mention that the Gladden Youth Sports Program is awesome. I got the pleasure of being a coach for their Pee Wee baseball league 3 years in a row, and that was an experience that I'll never forget. So you guys have a lot of great programs, and the sports program for the youth of the neighborhood is one of the most important in my opinion. So I'm glad that you were originally a part of that program specifically. So this episode is really focusing on about 1978 to 2004. And if our listeners recall, the first episode was 1797 to 1913, so the founding to the first big modern-day flood, really, in Franklinton. And then we talked to another set of guests about 1913 to about 1980, which was really the end of the first big flood, modern day flood, and then the FEMA designation that this was now a 100-year floodplain, which basically, in a lot of ways, froze the neighborhood in time for a couple of decades. And so this episode, number 3, is going to be from about 1978, 1980 to around 2004 and 5, when the flood wall got done, it was dedicated, and then the expectation was that the neighborhood was just going to turn on a dime. So you have both been very much a part of this the entire time. So Kevin, I'd like to start with you, because you talked a little bit about a concept that Jim and I were not familiar with originally, Jim Sweeney and I, but you called it a miracle year. And that was really when the neighborhood was really starting to recover, but just on the edge of the designation from FEMA. And so talk about what happened in what you described as that miracle year in this neighborhood, and how did it change the community?
Well, the community had been developing for quite a while before that, but in 74, 75, it changed. There were area commissions in North Franklinton, South Franklinton, East Franklinton, West Franklinton, 4 or 6 different little city commissions that all came together in 75 to form a single Franklinton area commission. So that was the year Larry Dandurin became director at Gladden. They put together the Franklinton Area Commission, and they kind of dedicated themselves to reclaiming the name Franklinton. The neighborhood was still mostly called the Bottoms by a lot of people all over the city at that point, and they wanted to regain some sense of neighborhood pride and neighborhood history. The Franklinton Historical Society started really promoting Franklinton historic heights and the fact that we are the oldest neighborhood in the city. Mm-hmm. There was a community newspaper called The Bottoms Up in 74, which became the Franklinton News in 1975, and was continuously published after that till 2016. So it was an attempt for the whole neighborhood to kind of reform. Gladden also put together all these small church food pantries that were scattered all over the neighborhood in 75 and combined them into a single consolidated pantry. All the churches supported it. So the neighborhood came together in a different way in 75 and started speaking to the city with a single voice.
Interesting. Okay, and I know that Carol Stewart was a huge, gigantic part of that entire movement, as well as others, Helen Evans and several other people that we were talking about earlier.
Helen was instrumental in founding the Area Commission, and she mentored Carol. She trained up Carol to become kind of her heir, and the two of them traded the chairmanship of the Franklinton Area Commission year to year for the next 2 decades.
And then Carol mentored just a whole bunch of people. Me, Jim, lots of people. So, and I want to take a real quick second to explain to the listeners, because I think it's worth talking about this for clarity, is that the Bottoms was initially an endearing term for this neighborhood because of the geography. It sat low. It had great fertile ground because of all the floods and the silt that came from the river, so you could grow just about anything here. And it really was it meant it was at the bottom of the hill.
Well, the bottomland is a farm term for rich, fertile soil.
And so that was a good thing for a long time. And then as we kind of get into the period that we're now talking about is when that really started to transition to a derogatory term, because it was like we were the bottom of the barrel. We had crime, we had this, we had that, we had disinvestment. So it's not a slight on the old term that we don't want to call it that anymore, but it's just trying to transition away from what that derogatory term meant.
Right, and we pretty much forbade that term for 3 decades, but then Bottoms Up Coffee Shop came and nicely asked if they could repurpose it.
Yeah.
And it's not a slur.
It's not a slur. Yeah.
Compliment.
Yeah. Carol Stewart corrected me several times. Anyway, Pauline, so you said that you got to the neighborhood in 1984. But you also spent some time on the Hilltop and in Westgate, where you had first met your husband. So tell us about what the neighborhood was like when you first moved down here with, and I'm sorry, I forget your husband's first name. Paul. Describe what it was like when you and Paul got together, got married, and then you moved into his house on Meek Avenue.
For me, I'll be honest with you, it was a disaster.
Oh, boy.
Because when I came from the Hilltop, and when we were married, I moved in a house that he had lived in practically all his life, a long time. He's a long-time resident of Franklinton. Honestly, when he drove down, moved me down, and I first looked at, when I first came into the neighborhood, I cried. Because if you want to hear what I had to say, I said, I cannot believe you brought me to this ghetto.
Well, because in 1984, it was pretty bad, right? I mean,
Yes.
that was a rough period of time.
North of Broad.
Yeah.
Where I am, north of Broad, and that's where he brought me to, and it was horrible. But after a while, I met Carol Stewart.
Yeah.
Because I wanted to talk. I talked to a lot of the neighbors north of Broad. And so I had talked to Carol Stewart, and I had gone to some of the area commissions. And at that time, I told her that I wanted to create another area of north of Broad.
Mm-hmm.
But she begged me not to, because she said, you're going to divide the neighborhood. And I told her at that time, the neighborhood is already divided. Broad Street divides the neighborhood. Because there was nothing going on north of Broad. The people did not know what was going on south of Broad, because they told me that nobody never came over from south of Broad to talk to these people living in this neighborhood.
Yeah, and that's just kind of a fact of the neighborhood in general, that there's a lot of hard divisions between areas. So a six lane Broad Street divides south and north. 315 divides east and west. Several of the areas where streets don't go all the way through because of the freeway systems that came in, that they didn't give them a tunnel access to maintain the throughway. So yeah, there's a lot of division. So I could understand for sure how you must have felt about that. But I want you to jump ahead just for a second with me, and I want you to talk about today. How do you feel?
Well, today I feel quite different, because I was working at that time in Worthington, Ohio. So I just really got in my car and went straight to work, come back home, went in the house, shut the door, and didn't come back out till the next morning. But as time went on and people began to ask me what could I do to help them become a part of Franklinton again, I don't know. Mm-hmm. So I said, well, I didn't know anything to do after I retired. I said, I'm going to get involved. And that's when I became involved in the area commission. I joined that area commission south of Broad. And I worked with Carol Stewart good, and so I'm still there. You
are, and I want to reemphasize what I said earlier. You've been one of the strongest proponents and advocates for this neighborhood that I've ever met. So we appreciate that. And I know you try to help me out a lot too, talking to these small businesses that
yes.
that I have trouble getting with the program. So Kevin, one of the ways that the neighborhood really kind of connected to Pauline's point was through the publication of Franklinton News. You told a really interesting story earlier about what created the need for the Franklinton News. And it has a lot to do with just the reputation the neighborhood was plagued with at that moment. So talk about that.
Well, it was an attempt to pull the neighborhood together, to share information, a kind of community bulletin board, or jungle drums, or whatever you want to call it, every single month. All the different organizations, groups that were working to improve Franklinton had a platform. Mm-hmm. So in any given issue of the paper, the area commission, the Historic Society, the Development Association, the library, the schools would all put information about what's coming up, so everybody knew if they wanted to go to various events, if they wanted to go to meetings, if they wanted to get involved. There was a single platform where they could find that out. Mm-hmm. And We published at one point about 20,000 issues of the paper. Later it was a smaller number. Not everybody in the neighborhood could read, but it went to the library, and people would read it to other people
People
and
could
tell
get
other
help.
people what was going on. And so it provided a cohesion for this neighborhood identity that they're trying to build in that period starting in 75.
Which really highlights a lot of the grit that we talk about with this neighborhood. You know, they figured out how to find the information, how to get the information. I mean, they needed that publication to do it, but even if they couldn't read, they figured out a way to get the information.
Yes, and it helped. I mean, one of the things that the Area Commission was trying to do from the beginning was speak to the city with a single voice. We need city support.
Yeah.
Trash, crime, all the other problems they were facing, they needed the city's support. Well, as a bunch of scattered pieces of the neighborhood, they didn't have that kind of power with the city. Mm-hmm. But once they pulled together, and spoke with one voice, and that was Helen and Carol both were very clear. We always want to speak with one voice so the city knows exactly where we stand.
Yeah.
So again, a community newspaper kind of helped everybody figure out where we want to go the next step with Franklinton.
Mm-hmm. You also told the story about, which really, again, Jim and I were like having these wow moments that the entire time we were talking earlier. You told the story about how much upheaval there was when Central High School closed. And then also the other schools, the Bellows Avenue School and the like. Can you recap that story a little bit? And then Pauline, I want you to jump in with the other types of upheaval that you were experiencing.
So yeah, we'll kick that part to her. But for background, I didn't come till '87. I wasn't here in 1982 when they closed Central High School, Bellows School, Chicago Avenue School, and sometime after that, Holy Family School shut down. So there was enormous drop in the schools in the neighborhood, but that also reflected a declining population in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
Maybe we can come back to that later because that's part of the story from 78 to 2005 is that the population has declined, and that's had a huge impact on a lot of things. Mm-hmm. But the school closings in '82, the neighborhood was in complete uproar. People were furious and in the streets, and you have some firsthand memory of that.
Yeah, Pauline, I'd like you to talk a little bit about those experiences.
Well, my experience was, and plus a lot of it I learned from my husband. I do know one thing, north of Broad segregation was terrible because the people north of Broad did not associate with people south of Broad. But as time went on, I began to pass the newspaper out to them and let them see what was doing, in North of Broad. However, I don't ever remember anybody really from south of Broad coming over and talking really to the people north of Broad.
Yeah.
And so, and I think all of it just started because at the time that's when, I guess, integration and everything had started, and it was just a little uproar there, and I didn't really understand, but that's what happened.
Because for historical context, this was a largely, I think you said, as much as 85%
Right.
white Appalachian population
Right.
for a long time. And then it started to shift as the disinvestment started taking hold and people started moving out. And now the way the neighborhood has grown back in population, now you said that it is much more diverse, and which you can kind of see it around. But that's talk about that and why that was the case.
Yeah, so we'll go back prior to 78. In the 50s and 60s, this was kind of a thriving blue-collar neighborhood. I mean, it's always had some crime and a lot of poverty, but it was a much more populated community. That decline started before 78. In the late 60s and early 70s, there was a lot of social unrest. Gladden went through 3 different directors in 5 years.
Oh, wow.
Because there was churn, and there were racial tensions, and there were economic tensions, and there was a lot of uproar in all central cities in the late 60s and early 70s.
It wasn't
Wild
unique to
time.
Franklinton. It was everywhere.
Everywhere.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they were building the interstates, and some people were moving out of the central cities out to the burbs. So that started some population decline. And jobs started going away. There were like 5,000 or 6,000 jobs at the Delco plant and the Westinghouse plants out on the west side that gradually went away over that period in the 70s and 80s. All the railroad jobs went away. Bruce Warner may have talked about that. There were a huge number of railroad jobs up into the 60s, and then they all went away.
Yeah.
And so you had this pretty solid blue-collar neighborhood. Most people worked. And over time, people moved out, jobs went away, poverty grew, housing deteriorated. So by the time I got here in 87, we were already losing population and housing stock.
Yeah.
And the Franklinton Development Association, in part, was created to try to slow that loss.
Yeah. Figure that out. Yeah.
I was on the commission in the early 90s, and our mission was to keep houses from being torn down. We fought every demolition permit that came down the pike because we were losing population. And so we get to that's the bubble you talked about. From 78 to 2005, the neighborhood was stuck in a bubble. It was a very active, dynamic, but shrinking neighborhood through that whole period.
So I want to get to a question and ask both of you how you feel the flood wall helped. And I think we all agree it didn't help as quickly as everyone kind of assumed it would. I think looking back in hindsight, it made sense that it didn't develop that fast, but I think that there was an expectation that was just going to be the end all be all. But talk about what I'd like to hear from you, like what the anticipation was when you guys found out that the Army Corps of Engineers was going to build a flood wall, that the Fed, the state, the county, the city, all of these entities came together and realized that, yep. And I know Deborah Price. So talk about what was that feeling like when the neighborhood all of a sudden realized that, hey, we're about to have a solution to the FEMA designation. Do you have any thoughts about what that was like when you guys realized that was actually going to be a thing?
I didn't, because
you just didn't trust it, maybe?
I didn't trust it.
Okay, all right,
And
fair.
plus, I was a little bit disappointed with
Yeah.
the city of Columbus, period. However, I still was willing to work through the area commission to see what we could get done about it.
Mm-hmm.
Because there for a while wasn't nothing going on. For me, I don't know, north of Broad wasn't nothing happening,
Yeah.
nothing. So I was just kind of like, I would put myself on a hold waiting to see what was going to happen.
And that's fair, because I think even today there's a lot of these things where it's like, yeah, well, I'll believe it when I see it going in the air. You know what I mean? And so I understand why your sentiment would have been that way. Yes. So now let's fast forward to what do you think of the benefit now?
I think of some of the benefit now because for me, it did not start until Michael Coleman became really the champion of Franklinton, because he started building houses. But before then, I want to say one thing. When I was on the Franklin Developmental Board, because believe it or not, I got on every board that was in Franklinton.
Yeah.
I was in there. And Bruce and a young man that works at Glad now built several houses. They did remodel several houses. Mm-hmm. Now they did start some remodeling. Franklin Development did.
Yeah.
Because I think they did about maybe three houses. Because I know they did one on my street.
Mm-hmm.
And by God, it's a mess now. But that's another story.
Okay.
I won't talk about that.
All right.
But now that I see a lot of building up and coming up, and I'm pretty much pleased about what they are doing, what the city is doing, but I don't like some of it, what they are doing.
Understood, and that's fair.
Can I go back? Let me go back to the flood wall.
Yeah.
So, for 20 years, we had monthly columns about the Franklinton flood wall update in the newspaper every single month. Mike Stinziano published a column keeping people up to date on how it was going. Mm-hmm. If you get a chance to interview Larry Dandura, and he could take you a step back to
I'd very much like to do that.
businessmen
Yeah.
like Tom Zanettos and other people who got together with Gene Watts and got that ball rolling
Yeah.
in the late 80s, I think. But it was a 20-year project. It had
Yeah.
to be refunded every year. They had to fight in Washington to get the funding to go forward every single year. So it was a long, hard.
It was a long, yeah. It was a slog, yeah. And I'd love to get Larry on here because he was I think I told you that earlier. He was the first person I met when I actually discovered Franklinton. So that was in about 2004, and I showed up at Gladden and tried to ask what I could do, and that was Larry. So it's partly a question of be very careful what you ask for. Well, yeah.
Because from a city development point of view, the flood wall is the greatest thing that ever happened to Franklinton, obviously.
Sure.
Huge amounts of development and outside investment flowing into the neighborhood now.
Yeah.
It took 15 years.
Yeah.
But we're at a tipping point now where the neighborhood is really
It's starting to make sense now. Yeah.
renaissance. But from a resident point of view, it's been pretty disruptive.
Yes, and all of the things. I think there's going to be a whole nother episode about the ways that we're trying to mitigate that. But it's a challenge. One other thing I wanted to touch on as it relates to the flood wall is, so Gladden Community House had a renovation that you had to be flood restriction compliant
14 feet
with,
up.
and also the library went through the same process. And so, I was going to ask you, so you had to accommodate 14 feet of height. So basically, because of that, you guys have all of that empty space that you can't do anything with, because back in the day when you did want to renovate, you had a floodplain restriction.
Right, in 1992, and that was the same across the whole neighborhood.
So
The library has since kind of filled in some of their shell below.
sort of, kind of, yeah.
They had to go up the same 14 feet that we did.
Yeah. So,
And from 78 to 2004, you could not build a new house.
you
in
could not build
Franklinton.
new.
You
Yeah.
could not improve the value of an existing structure more than 50%.
Yeah.
We had to play some of those games when we renovated Gladden in 92.
Yeah.
We had to build the addition first before we renovated the existing building to increase the value, so we weren't increasing.
So you
more
had
than
to
50%.
one step at a time. Wow. Wow. So I thought that was an interesting point, because those are both sort of unique buildings because of that, and it just illustrates the breadth of the consequences of the floodplain designation.
And this neighborhood, obviously would have developed much, much, much sooner without the flood.
Yeah.
I mean, once the flood wall was done, here's this beautiful patch of ground right next to downtown that has never been developed. Why? Because you couldn't.
Yeah.
And so once the doors open, development has come rushing in.
Yeah. So Pauline, where we sit today, we have houses about to be built on Mount Carmel campus. We've got houses that are almost finished at Glenwood and Broad. We've got a new development over on Green Street. We've got Gravity. We've got River and Rich. We've got Graham Ford that's about to be something. What's your outlook? What do you think?
Well, I'm going to be honest with you. I think it's very nice. I'm very appreciative that the city decided to allow people to now start building the big, tall buildings and all of that. That's good.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm still not happy with it. I'm not happy because I can't be happy when I know that my people are not being happy. I cannot do it. I just can't do it.
I kind of asked you that question to sort of make that point really solidly from a longtime resident, because it's, and I don't think this is lost on the developers that we have good partnerships with, because they do incorporate affordable housing, they do incorporate those things, but I think that's a good point, is that this neighborhood still needs to be very, very sensitive to the folks that Gladden serves, and the folks that Lower Lights serves, and the folks that have lived here for a very long time and have been here way longer than I have.
Yes.
And so this celebrating 225 years is a good way to just kind of reiterate the point. that the history is important, and those legacy residents are part of the history.
Well, they'll be part of the history.
Yeah.
However, but when I think about it, they are building everybody's building the new houses, they're building all the tall buildings and everything. And what makes me sad is because there's nothing being really offered to the people that live here in the community. For me, it's nothing here to offer to us.
And yeah,
And I
I
feel sad about that.
And I'll tell you, Gladden still being here and all of the ways that we're trying to incorporate programs to make sure that service does happen the way you want it. That's something we will continue to work on, and I know that you'll be there helping us do it.
Well, I'm gonna be there working to help you do it. I just hope I live long enough to see some of it.
I am confident you will. You're a young woman by chronological standards. So you're
Chronologically,
yes.
I guess you could say. But I am an 82-year-old woman, and I don't have as much time as I had.
Well, we
behind me.
appreciate
But
the
I'm
time
gonna
that you
keep
spend
working
with
till
us
the day I die for Franklinton.
for Franklinton. So Kevin, I'd like to hear just sort of a final thought from you. Gladden has new leadership now. You guys have a very strong board. What do you think the outlook for Gladden is, and how have the developers that have come into the neighborhood? Because I know that Cover My Meds has been pretty integral. I think Thrive and others have also contributed in different ways. So what's your take on it?
I mean, this has always been a challenge, and any settlement house in a neighborhood that's gentrifying has got to figure out how to bridge the gaps between the older residents and the new residents, between the lower income residents and new, more affluent residents. I don't know. It's a dance, and over the next 2 decades, Gladden will have to evolve to recognize both of those.
Yeah,
populations, be more responsive to new residents with different needs and interests. But we're not going to quit supporting the low-income residents here that are still struggling, and we'll try to bridge that gap. It's been a challenge from day one to leverage some of the new development that was in East Franklinton to help support the residential neighborhood that's in central West Franklinton, north and broad. Everybody's been trying to do that. It's just a hard thing to do.
And I would say that's getting better and better and better over time. I think that's going to continue to just simply get easier because those conversations continue to happen. They continue to be relevant, and they're not being ignored. So
technically, Franklinton was the lowest income neighborhood in Franklin County for the last 3 decades. Mm-hmm. That is probably changing as more affluent people move in.
As we speak.
The median income, the average income is going up. The median maybe hasn't moved too much.
Yeah.
So that is still the case. In the residential part of Franklinton, this is still a very low-income, struggling community.
Yeah. Lots of challenges still ahead of us, but lots of things to be proud of. Lots of efforts that I'm encouraged by, and you two are absolutely very important elements in all of those conversations because, Pauline, I know that you're one of the most respected opinions in this neighborhood, and Kevin, the work that you do at Gladden and the results that Gladden brings to the community and the assistance that it provides is really second to none. So it's been an extreme pleasure to talk with you both today. So I'm going to do a little wrap up here, and then we're going to conclude at the end with something special. Okay. So thank you for joining us for this 3rd episode of the Franklintennial podcast series, celebrating 225 years of Franklinton. We want to thank Jim Fia Productions for all of this incredible equipment and their ability to make us sound so good. The Franklintennial Committee for supporting this idea and helping us fundraise to make it happen. Land Grant, again, for this beautiful facility. I usually come here to have fun. Now I'm here to work, and it feels just as good. And then our sponsors, our financial sponsors, Kaufman Development and Casto, who have both been integral development partners in what's going on in the neighborhood. And then also I want to once again recognize the 4 interns helping Jim Fia today. They are interns with Transit Art and they are through Gladden Community House. And that's a program that's spearheaded by Jackie Calderon, and we're thrilled to have them here and learning production in a real-time setting with like actual things happening. So it's a great way for them to learn, and we're proud that we get to be part of this with them involved. And I'm going to mention one more thing here real quick, and I'm going to mention this in our 4th episode as well. May is Bike Month. So Franklinton Cycle Works. Anybody watching this podcast, whether it's May or not when you watch it, if you need a bike, go to Franklinton Cycle Works, because I would be remiss as the Board of Trade Director if I didn't say that and recognize May being Bike Month, and we have Franklinton Cycle Works right here in our neighborhood. So thanks again for you guys to be here. Pauline, I have just a ton of respect for you. Kevin, it's always a pleasure to talk to you and work alongside you. So with that, Kevin, you've got a fresh beer right there. Pauline, you've got your Gatorade, and I've got a beer. So we want to toast to you two, and also toast to the birth year of Franklinton. Happy 225.
Thank you.
Thanks you.